Hello, wow, I have just treated you all to a snippet of Beyonce's latest single, Break My Soul. Yes, you're welcome everybody. And for those of you that know the old school Beyonce music, are fans of her, you're probably thinking, this is a really different style to some of her old stuff. But if you're a true fan out there, you'll learn to love it. It'll grow on you. And if you've never heard that before, you're thinking, what the heck was that? Just go and listen to the whole song afterwards, and maybe it will change your mind. But this song was only released last month, and as you can tell from the beat, it's quite catchy, right? And to be honest, I felt quite empowered by the beat and the lyrics. I don't know if you could hear at the beginning, but there's a bit that's like, release your job, release your stress, release the love, forget the rest. And she quit her job as well. And I took it, as most of the internet did, as Beyonce telling us to quit our jobs, just like this tweet on there. Yeah, right? This kind of thing went viral at the time that this song came out. And I'm sure a lot of you, especially my husband, will be glad to know that I haven't taken Beyonce's lyrics to heart, and I haven't quit my job. Even though she's fabulous, she's a queen, she's one of my favorite artists, I've decided not to live my life by her song lyrics. I'm sure you'll be glad to know. But joking aside, I have actually genuinely come close to quitting my job before, and the closest I got to that point when I was working during the peak of COVID-19. And some of you may know that I'm a doctor, that's what I do for work, and I graduated medical school in August 2019. So I had a few months to settle into working for the first time in my life and being a doctor after a long 6-year degree, and then COVID hit. Yay. So it wasn't quite the start to working life that I imagined, and especially the peak during the first few months of 2020 were particularly bad. It hit us quite bad here in Norfolk, and I wasn't dealing well with the stress of working on COVID wards. I became really low at that time, and I generally considered quitting and giving up on the job that I'd always dreamed of doing. You know, I'm sure that I'm not the only one here today or listening online or catching up on this who's had thoughts like that before, whether it be due to the pandemic or not. We've all had moments where we just want to give up, right? We want to give up on jobs, degrees, on school maybe, on relationships, give up on dreams or hopes that have just had too many setbacks or led to too many disappointments. Or maybe it's the church. Maybe the church has hurt you or let you down in the past, and you've decided to give up on it. Or perhaps you've given up on the hope that a broken relationship might be mended at some point, or your job or your house move situation might improve. You know what? There are definitely things or people in our life that can be toxic or detrimental to our health and prosperity, and we should definitely get rid of those things, but I'm not talking about that for the moment. But I want to ask, are we happier in our lives when we get rid of everything that challenges us? You know, what about the opportunities or the people that we don't even give a second thought to or second chance to see if things might actually change? And maybe you're thinking, do you know what, you're not describing me at all. I don't give up, I don't quit easily at all. And you know what, it's true. Some people are really good at growing and learning and adapting, and that is great. And I think we can fall into two categories when it comes to our mindset. And this is not something I've come up with myself. It's from a book called Mindset by a psychologist called Dr. Carol Dweck. And through years of research, she's discovered what is described as this groundbreaking idea in her book, and that is the power of our mindset. And in this book, she details that how we can actually achieve success in our lives due to having the correct mindset. And she talks about two different types. All right, so the first one is called a fixed mindset. And the second one is called a growth mindset. So with the fixed mindset, a fixed mindset person believes that we are all born with a certain level of intelligence. And then that intelligence is fixed, and you can't improve upon that. We all have certain personalities, we all have certain moral characters, and that's it. Essentially, we can't change. So if something doesn't fit or something doesn't work in life, then a fixed mindset person would give up on it. And now the other mindset is called a growth mindset. And this is the belief that your basic qualities are things that you can cultivate through putting in effort. right? That everything can change and everything can grow through application and experience. That it's actually impossible to foresee what can be accomplished because you can always grow. And that sounds pretty good, right? But it's not the answer to all of our problems, so don't switch off yet. And some of you might be thinking, yeah, that does sound good, but what about God? I mean, we're in church after all. Come on, Esther, got to talk about God. Don't worry, I'm getting there. So what these two mindsets come down to is ourselves. What we can achieve ourselves, what we can do ourselves, either because of what we have or what we can grow to have, or the effort that we can put in ourselves to grow ourselves. Well, I want to offer you guys a third mindset. And to do that, we're going to go Old Testament and look at Joseph. And whether you're a Christian or not here today, or listening or catching up to this, or if you've read the Bible before or not, I'm sure a lot of us in this room or listening to this would have heard about this man named Joseph. He's pretty famous when it comes to people in the Bible. I mean, Joseph and the amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat. Anyone familiar with that? A few people? Yes, love it. So who was this man? So we learn about Joseph's life in the beginning of the Bible, in the book of Genesis. And he has quite the journey, if I'm honest. And his story is told across chapters 37 to 41 in Genesis, which is a lot of chapters. I'm not going to read that all for you guys this morning. Instead, I'm going to summarize the key bits for you. So he was a 17-year-old boy. He was the son of a man named Jacob, and the second youngest of 12 brothers. And Joseph, he was the favorite son, okay, out of all of those brothers, and his dad made this ornate robe for him. And his brothers were very jealous of him, and they hated him because their dad loved him the most. Which, you know, I kind of think is fair enough. I mean, I'm not a parent, but I'm pretty sure parents aren't supposed to have favorites, right? The parents in the room. But I do feel like some parents have favorites, you know, whether they acknowledge it or not. And some parents are like looking down now, and all the like kids in the room are like, yeah, I'm definitely the favorite, or I'm not the favorite. It's true. But anyway, Jacob, he made it very clear that Joseph was his favorite and he loved him the most. And then Joseph has this dream. And in Genesis 37:5, he tells it to his brothers, and when he tells them the dream, they hate him all the more, as if they couldn't hate him anymore, but they do. And essentially, his dreams revolve around him one day ruling over everyone, including his family, and everyone having to bow down to him. And obviously, his brothers were not okay with this, and I guess they acted really reasonably to the situation, and they decided that they would kill him. You know, that's, yeah, fair enough. And when they thought, maybe that's a little bit extreme, instead they just decided to throw him into an empty pit and then sell him into slavery instead, because that's like less extreme. Oh, they weren't done there. They decided to tell their dad that his favorite son, the one he loved the most, was dead. Right, so you can see why this makes for great theatre, right? It's quite dramatic. But if we take a moment to consider Joseph's mindset in this situation, he's just been sold into slavery by his own brothers. He doesn't know when he's going to see his family again. Now, if he had what I've described as a fixed mindset, he'd probably decide, you know, it's time to release all that hate, release all the anger, and just quit. Maybe give up on that dream. Clearly, it's not for him. A growth mindset Joseph would view this as a small bump in the road, maybe, and he'd work hard at getting back to where he wanted to be in order to fulfill his dreams. So Joseph ends up in Egypt, and he ends up being bought by a man named Potiphar, who was one of Pharaoh's officials at the time. And if we read in Genesis 39 from verse 2, the Lord was with Joseph so that he prospered, and he lived in the house of his Egyptian master. And when his master saw that the Lord was with him and that the Lord gave him success in everything he did, Joseph found favor in his eyes and became his attendant. Potiphar put him in charge of his household, and he entrusted his care everything he owned. The Lord was with Joseph. There's no mention of Joseph giving up or about his work ethic, but all about God's being with him. The Lord was with him so that he prospered. The Lord gave him success. So despite going through quite the trauma, Joseph was doing quite well at this point because God was with him. But then comes another hurdle for Joseph. So Potiphar's wife lies and accuses Joseph of trying to sleep with her, and this leads to Potiphar putting Joseph into prison. Now, again, a fixed mindset person probably would just give up and quit. Really, this is another sign that your dream of ruling over all is not for you. A growth mindset person perhaps would do all they could to improve the situation despite being in prison. But Joseph, he didn't follow either one of these. Genesis 39:21. But while Joseph was there in prison, the Lord was with him. He showed him kindness and granted him favor in the eyes of the prison warden. Again, God was with him. And after a while, Joseph does have an opportunity to be released from prison. There's the cupbearer and baker of Pharaoh at that time. They end up in prison. And one night, they both have this dream, and they're sad because there's no one there to interpret it. And Joseph steps in. And he's able to interpret the dreams of both of these men. And he asks the cupbearer, whose dream meant that he would be restored to his original position, that when he's out of prison, to show Joseph some kindness and help him get out of there. And what does the cupbearer do? He forgets about Joseph. So Joseph is still in prison. Another hurdle for him. And we skip on a little bit later, and Joseph is still there, and his dream seems to be getting further and further away from him. And again, fixed or growth mindset. This is a difficult time for Joseph. A couple years later, there's another opportunity for him to be released from prison. And this time, it's Pharaoh that has a dream that nobody can interpret. And this time, the cupbearer remembers Joseph, rightly so, and they call upon him to interpret the dream. And I love his response in Genesis 41:16. He says, "I cannot do it." Joseph replied to Pharaoh, "But God will give Pharaoh the answer he desires." And he ends up interpreting the dreams, and this leads Pharaoh to placing him in charge of all of the land in Egypt. That's the dream, guys, if you didn't notice. He's in charge of all of the land. And Joseph is in a position where he guides Pharaoh through years of abundance and then these years of famine, and eventually he's reunited with his family. And I would encourage you to go away, if you've not read this account before, and read the whole thing for yourselves. But what I want us to look at and to consider this morning is how Joseph endured all of those years, how he got through that time of being as far away from his dream as he could have been. And it wasn't due to a fixed mindset. It wasn't due to a growth mindset. It was due to a grace mindset. It wasn't about the skills or the qualities he possessed, or how hard he worked. It was because of the goodness of God. It was God's favor and grace upon his life. You know, at each hurdle, God was with him. At each point where things seemed impossible, Joseph saw the goodness of God. At all the many points he could have given up, in all the moments that Joseph knew he wasn't enough, he knew that God's grace was enough. You know, he didn't give up, nor did he rely on his own strength. And we saw throughout this account that God was with him and that Joseph trusted in him. He trusted in him to interpret the dreams. God was with him, and so he prospered. You know, I read this essay on grace by a man called Sam Storms, who's part of this group called the Gospel Coalition, and he put grace like this: an oft overlooked dimension of God's grace is the way it comes to us as power for daily living. Grace is not simply the principle by which we are saved and delivered from God's wrath, but it's also the power of God's presence. It's more than an attitude or disposition in the divine nature. Grace is the power of God's Spirit converting the soul. It's the activity or movement of God whereby he saves and justifies the individual through faith. Therefore, grace is not something in which we merely believe. It is something we experience as well. And this is exactly what we see in Joseph's story. Grace is written all over it. The power of God's presence brings him through these difficult times, blesses him in abundance. You know, Joseph's soul does not get broken. Instead, it's strengthened through his faith in God. You know, last weekend, Phil preached a brilliant message, and as part of that, he talked about a man named Paul that we learn about in the New Testament. You know, he's someone that goes through his fair share of hardships, but he also adopts this grace mindset. In 2 Corinthians, Paul is talking about being tormented by this thorn in his flesh, and he's asking God to take it away from him. And in chapter 12:9, God replies, each time he said, "My grace is all you need. My power works best in weakness." And Paul continues in verse 9, "So now I am glad to boast about my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ can work through me. That's why I take pleasure in my weaknesses and in the insults and the hardships and the persecutions and troubles that I suffer for Christ. For when I am weak, then I am strong." You know, Paul is addressing this fact that it's the power of Jesus that works through him. This power that he mentions comes from the fact that Jesus Christ died on a cross and was resurrected for us, for me and for you. And this is the way that we have been saved through Jesus. This is how we can have eternal lives and experience God's power and presence in our day-to-day lives. This is God's grace for us. You know, a grace mindset puts the focus off ourselves and onto God. A grace mindset means that we can still stand strong when we feel weak. A grace mindset means that we can acknowledge that we are not enough, but we can be glad that we can trust in a God who is sufficient for all our needs, who we can lean on when our troubles are too hard, who we can lean to when we feel like giving up. So how does this work? How do we adopt this grace mindset? I have 2 steps for you guys to take away today. And if you're taking notes, the first step is to release your mind. And yes, I stole that line from Beyonce, but it's all good. But I'm not calling you to give up your jobs, to quit everything, to jump on a plane and escape to a sunny paradise. But it's quite sunny here at the moment, to be fair, so you can all stay here. But what I am suggesting to you guys is to release what holds you back or what pulls you away from adopting a grace mindset. To release your worries, to release your stress, to release your fears. You know, overwhelming thoughts of fear or stress can hinder us from achieving our full potential in life. Worry, being our first response to a challenging situation, can actually stop us from seeing how God can use that situation to help us grow stronger. 1 Peter 5, verse 7 says, "Cast all your anxiety onto him because he cares for you." In other words, release your worries or your stress onto God because he cares for you. You know, in the account of Joseph, at every setback he faces, there's no mention of panic, no mention of worry. Instead, there are numerous indications of how he trusted in God. So practically speaking, how do we release our minds? You know what? Sometimes you just need to take a minute, you know? In the midst of a difficult time, when faced with a stressful situation, take a minute to stop and pause. Before responding in the heat of the moment, take a minute to breathe and think. Take a minute to pray. Take a minute to release your mind through prayer. Give your worries over to God, knowing that he cares for you. You know, back in that time when I wanted to quit my job, my very wise husband reminded me that it probably wasn't the best idea to make such a big decision right in the heat of it all, and instead to take some time to think. You know, sometimes we do need to get out of situations quickly when they're dangerous or unsafe, but more often than not, what we need to do is take a minute. Take the time to release our worries to God and refocus on his grace. Take a minute to remember that when we are weak, then we are strong. And that brings me to my second point for you, and that is to receive the truth. So once you've released your mind, you then need to fill it with the truth. God's truth that enables us to walk through life. You know, the most important truth is that God loved us so much that he gave his one and only son for us. And it doesn't matter what we've done, what we haven't done, who we are, where we come from, but God loves each and every one of us. And he gave his son, his only son Jesus, to die for us so that we could be in relationship with him. And this is what we describe as saving grace. We are saved by grace through faith in Jesus. And if you're listening to this, if you're here today and you don't know Jesus in that way, then I would love to give you an opportunity to be in relationship with him. I'm going to lead us in a prayer shortly to accept Jesus into your life. But you know what? Life is full of these moments when we need to be reminded of God's truth. You know, the first, as I said, is to understand that you are saved by grace. And then you can begin to walk through life knowing God's truth that we find in the Bible, God's word that's there to equip us in our day to day. You know, when you feel broken or lost, receive the truth that God's grace is all you need. When you feel weary or tired, receive the truth that God will strengthen you. When you feel like giving up, receive the truth that God is for you and he has a plan and purpose for your life. When you face trials in your life, receive the truth that faith produces perseverance. Perhaps you want to find some scriptures in the Bible this week. You want to find a verse or a passage to reflect on in those moments when you need to take a minute. Maybe you want to reflect on 2 Corinthians 12:9, which I read out earlier. Each time he said, "My grace is all you need. My power works best in weakness." Or maybe it's James 1, verse 2-3. "Consider it pure joy, my brothers and sisters, whenever you face trials of many kinds, because you know that the testing of your faith produces perseverance." Perhaps you want to start with that truth I mentioned earlier, John 3:16. "For God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son, that whoever believes in him shall not perish, but have eternal life." Whatever that verse is, whatever the passage is for you, can I encourage you to memorize it? Have it somewhere in your home that you can look at it and reflect on it every day. You know, releasing our minds and receiving the truth is how we adopt this grace mindset. It's how we can experience God's grace in our lives, the power that he gives to us to live our lives, the power he gives to us freely to live full and prosperous lives. And I wonder what that would look like if we all chose to adopt a grace mindset, if we chose to see the goodness of God through our trials. What would our world look like if more of us chose to not give up, but to instead persevere? What would our church look like if we were determined not to rely on our own strength, but let God work in us and through us to do what we can do in order for God to do what only he can do? You know, I believe we would see hope rise in our city, our town, and beyond. I believe we'd see this next generation believe in the power of the church. I believe we would experience more joy despite the battles in our lives and in the lives of those around us. Adopt a grace mindset. Release your mind and receive the truth. Allow God's grace to meet all your needs and watch as he transforms your life.